Hey folks, and welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And specifically today we're looking at a bunch of ChiFi IEMs. There's 5 of them in total, and they all sit under the $300 mark, with most of them being under $200. As always with a roundup like this, my interest is to see where there might be some bargains to be had, where there's some hidden gems that you might not have otherwise heard of. And on this occasion, I've also got 2 very specific questions, which is to find out if any of these are clearly that much better, particularly the ones closer in price, to the Moondrop Aria Snow. I was really impressed with the Snow when I reviewed it recently in a different roundup, and so when I got around to this bunch, the Snow was kind of in my mind as the one that I wanted to compare everything to. So one of my questions and one of my comparison points will be the Snow throughout this review, and the other one is to find out if the SeeAudio Bravery is worth the significant jump in price. And so to put that into context, let me give you a quick introduction of the different IEMs I've got here, and then we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of each before we get to the sound. Starting from cheapest to most expensive, the first one off the mark is a brand new option from BQEYZ, and it's called the Topaz. The Topaz retails for $90 and it uses a piezoelectric driver similar to what's in the Rapco hook that I've reviewed recently. And from there we jump up in price over the $100 threshold to the next option being the Simgot EM2R. The R stands for Roltion or Roltion, I'm not entirely sure what that word is, but it's generally referred to as the EM2R and it retails for $110. From there, we jump up to 2 $119 units, being the tin Hifi P1 Max and the Shuoer or Shuoer D13. And I'm going to explain a lot more about what each of these is, the technologies in it. I know I mentioned the Topaz had piezoelectric. I'll go through the others shortly. But before we get there, the final one I want to mention is the SeeAudio Bravery, which is a $279 IEM. And so as I said, we've got quite the range here. With the first 4 units, they're close enough to the Moondrop Aria Snow in price that I was curious to see if they're actually going to be better, because I think the Aria Snow is fantastic. And then when we suddenly leap more than double the price up to the SeeAudio Bravery, the next question is it worth the jump? And so to kick things off, let's talk about the design, the accessories, fit, comfort, all those things. And rather than go through unit by unit and talk about everything about them, what I'd like to do is just tell you about the standouts from each of these devices. If you want to know the full specifications, there'll be links down below in the description where you can go and read up on each of these. So I'm not going to go into the impedance, the sensitivity. I will talk about driver types a little bit later. But for now, let's just talk about the key standouts, both good and bad, of the accessories, the fit, the comfort, and the build, etc. Starting with the Topaz. As I said before, this is the cheapest in the lot here, and it's a pretty thick feeling IEM, and I mean that as in THICC. It's got a really chunky build, but it's a lovely build for the price. I think the cable is absolutely fantastic for the price. This is another one of those outstanding cables. We're seeing a few of them from time to time now where the cable seems to be better than the price tag of the IEM would suggest it should be, and I love that. And the Topaz also happens to come with some really nice tips. So it's quite a standout in the sense that when you're paying only $90 for it, you're getting a fantastic looking and feeling IEM with a wonderful cable and a nice set of tips. So that's the standouts here, not talking about sound yet, we'll get to that shortly, and also driver types as well. But the next one up we've got is the EM2R from Simgot. Now I reviewed the Simgots years ago, the original EM2s, their EN700 Pros, and they made some lovely IEMs back then, so I was interested to see if it was more of the same, if it was better, if they'd changed their tuning, etc. And the EM2R is an interesting one. It's exactly the same general design as the old EM2, and that's not a bad thing necessarily. They're a nice compact shape, they fit well. The nozzle's fairly long and fairly thick, which could be an issue for some people, but generally speaking, I think they're pretty solid. The cable's fine, it's not special, but there's nothing at all wrong with it. And there's a nice range of tip options with tuning tips for either a balanced / brighter sound or a bassier sound, and that's essentially just changing the size of the hole or the bore through the tip itself. And all in all, what you get with the EM2R is pretty solid for the price. I don't think it feels quite as special as the Topaz does, but it's certainly not anything that I would say is a problem. But there is one thing I do want to talk about with the EM2R, and that is that you're getting a lot of packaging for the money. For $119 in the fairly large box, and the size of the box is no issue really, but inside that box, you're getting a badge, a metal printed badge. There's this sort of glossy card in a special fold-out holder, and there's just a lot of extra stuff that I don't know is necessary, and I have to wonder if that's adding to the price. Personally, I'd prefer to see a better cable, better tips. Not that there's anything wrong with either of those two choices in the EM2R, but I'd prefer to see either even better tips and cable, or to see the price come down a bit, rather than getting all these bits that, personally, I don't think we need. Maybe you do. Let me know in the comments down below if you appreciate things like the badge, the card, which I think's got the serial number and owner information. Let me know if those things are important to you down in the comments. I personally don't care about them, but maybe some people do. Moving on from the EM2R, we've then got our two $119 units. And starting with the tin Hifi P1 Max, we've got again a nice shell. It's kind of a chunky acrylic sort of shell, a nice faceplate on it. It feels pretty good. It probably looks a bit more expensive than it is. It's got a nice cable again, not a special cable, but nice. I think the Topaz cable is still probably slightly ahead for me, but this is also a very nice one. The set of tips that come with the P1 Max are also very nice. However, there is one drawback for me, which is that it doesn't come with any kind of case. It comes with a little soft carry pouch, which for me, in an acrylic style IEM like this, I would like to see a case. I think some of the solid metal IEMs, like say the blonde BL01s and BL03s, they're going to handle a bit of bumping around in a canvas bag. I'd be a bit more concerned about these not standing up to that so well when we've got a couple of pieces of acrylic essentially glued together somehow. I would like to see a case, a proper case for those. It's not a deal breaker for me, but I did think it was a bit of a drawback and I wanted to mention it. Then we've got the other $119 option here, which is the Shuoer or the Shuoer D13. And on this occasion, we've got a little metal shell. It's a lovely shaped and sized shell. I really like the design of these. They're probably my favorite and most unique looking IEM that I've come across in a while, at least in this price point. And when you open up the package of these, you get a few interesting bits and pieces. Firstly, you get this interesting looking and very comfortable style shell. But then you get some really nice tip options. You get a nice cable that's probably on par with something like the P1 Max cable, but it's terminated in this case in a 4.4mm plug, which I like. It gives you more versatility, assuming you've got adapters. And then the final thing that I really like about the D13s is the nozzle here can be unscrewed and you get a different pair of nozzles. And what that means is you can tune these. You've got one with a brass coloured mesh on the end or a gold coloured mesh on the end, and another with a silver coloured mesh. And they do sound different. One of them, I think from memory it's the silver, has a bit of extra material behind the metal mesh, so on the inside of the metal mesh, and it does change the tuning, and I'll talk about that shortly. So I love the fact that at $119 you're getting a metal shell which looks and feels great, you're getting a tunable IEM, and then other solid accessories as well that are on par with anything else here. So the D13 on paper and in terms of the unboxing experience starts to look like some of the best value here, but we'll wait and see how it sounds, of course. The final option to talk about before we get into the sound is the SeeAudio Bravery. The last SeeAudio product I reviewed was the SeeAudio Yuma, and that was a really nice IEM. It wasn't to my taste sonically, but it was definitely a beautifully built IEM. And now the Bravery's coming along and upping that again. This is an absolutely gorgeous IEM. It's an acrylic shell again. It's that sort of pseudo custom universally style where it's quite molded in an acrylic shell. It's got a lovely finish on the faceplates. And then on top of that, it's got a beautiful cable. This is the best of the cables in this bunch. It's got a nice simple twisted layout with a lovely soft fabric. It's just a gorgeous cable. I think probably the only thing I can knock about it is a 3.5mm plug instead of a balance plug, but that could also come down to the version you buy. And then to take it a step further, the tips you're getting with the SeeAudio Bravery are ASLA tips, which are some of the best on the market. They're up there, depending on which you prefer for you compared to, say, Final Audio tips or Spin Fits or JVC Spiral Dots. I think the ASLA tips are some of the best out there, and that's what these come with as standard, which I think is fantastic. So even though the range of tips isn't huge, with the SeeAudio Bravery, the quality of tips is excellent, and that gives them full marks in my book. I would much rather lesser tips of better quality than a whole range of tips of average to poor quality. Not that anyone here is providing poor quality tips, but I definitely appreciate the premium ones. And so from an unboxing and quality point of view, I think all of these are delivering a good, solid experience. They've all got nice build quality, nice tips, nice cables, etc. Some are stronger than others, but there's none of them that I think don't deliver on what you expect for the price. And whilst there's a couple of standouts in terms of cables, tips, the build quality is a bit variable, but all pretty solid, I think generally speaking, there's nothing here that I would say puts one or other out of the question or more into the question than any other IEM. And so with that in mind, let's start talking about sound quality, and as always, starting at the bottom and working our way up, meaning that we're going to begin with the BQEYZ Topaz. And I want to start here by saying a huge thanks to BQEYZ. They sent me out the Topaz. I'd never tried any of their IEMs before, and I was interested in this because it's using a piezoelectric driver, and as far as I can tell, it's only a piezoelectric driver. There's no dynamic or balanced armature or planar along with it. It's pure piezoelectric. Now, if you've never heard of piezoelectric drivers, I talked about these also in my Raptgo hook review recently, and what it basically is, it's a ceramic component that vibrates with the current passing through it, in this case the musical signal, and so it's quite different from other drivers in the fact that it's not a diaphragm moving back and forth so much as this actual component just vibrating in place, as I understand it. Theoretically, that should mean very clean, very pure sound because you're not having to deal with driver breakup as it moves through its excursion pattern. It should be a very clean sound, and so I was curious to see if the Topaz could deliver on that. And what I heard when I fired it up was an overall tonal balance that's quite good from the Topaz. It's clearly still a budget IEM, but it sounds good for the price you're paying. Unfortunately, one thing that I do notice listening to the Topaz, and I heard this with the Raptgo hook as well, is that the piezoelectrics seem to produce a slightly unnatural quality in the treble, and it shifts the timbre of instruments into a sort of slightly tinny, slightly metallic sounding space. So I'm not yet totally convinced that piezoelectrics are a good answer in IEMs. Maybe I'll be proved wrong in the future, I certainly hope so, but for now I don't think they're quite ideal. What is kind of cool to see though is that they're able to produce a full frequency range, and indeed the bass quality from the Topaz is quite strong. And what I mean by that is the quantity of bass is quite strong. There is still a bit of a drawback, and again this is one of those areas where I hope piezoelectrics can improve in future, because the quantity is quite good, so we can see that piezoelectrics can do the full range of frequencies, but it all comes across a bit muted. The bass qualities are not quite as dynamic as I'd like, and to give an example, if you listen to some music with kick basses in it, it sounds like they've stuffed the kick bass full of blankets, and that's not the case in the recording. I've tried these recordings on lots of other things, and it's only the piezoelectric in the Topaz that gives it that sound like it's overstuffed with blankets. So everything's a bit muted, the sense of dynamics is just a little bit lacking, but it's not a bad listen, I can't stress that enough. It just makes it a bit polite. It makes it a little bit less kind of full and rich and resonant. And of course, then we've got that slight treble issue with the overemphasis in the high frequencies and that slightly off timbre quality. But I think overall, I'd say the Topaz is an interesting listen. If you're looking to drop under $100 on something different and interesting, they're not bad by any stretch. They don't set my world on fire. I'm not sitting here highly recommending them, but they're definitely an interesting and good listen. One thing that they do well within that, and I should mention this because I don't want to make it sound like they're bad, is they deliver a nice sense of texture and detail. So if you are someone that wants something a bit more laid back, but that's still delivering texture and detail, and often those things don't go together. Normally, texture and detail means you're getting a lot of treble, a lot of energy. With the Topaz, they manage to balance it differently. So you're getting texture and detail, but in a laid back, very slightly muted kind of way, and I think they're actually really interesting. So let's park the Topaz there and move on to the Simgot EM2R and see if it's worth spending more to get the Simgot. Start by saying thank you to Simgot for sending out the EM2R for me to try, and I should also mention that my testing for these after playing around a bit was using the bass tips out of the selections provided by Simgot, so keep that in mind. You can tweak this a little bit if you prefer a different tonality, but I liked how the bass tips sounded, so that's what I went with. And then the final thing to mention is that the Simgot EM2R uses a combination of a dynamic and a balanced armature, so these are sort of a traditional two-driver hybrid design. And the most striking thing when I first put them on was that they're a very detailed sound, and indeed it could be a little bit too crisp and too clean and detailed for some people, but I think it's well managed. It's not one of those IEMs that I felt was harsh or in my face, but it definitely has a sense of articulation and clarity at the top end that some people might find too much. Depending on the source that you're pairing it with, it could be too much, but I personally really liked it. Another standout from the EM2R is they give you a great sense of tactility in the bass, and the mid-range too for that matter. You can actually feel the music as much as you can hear it, and that's a quality that I often find very engaging in IEMs that you don't always get. So I liked everything I was hearing from them so far, and probably the only thing that was not entirely to my liking with them is they do have a little bit of upper mid-range emphasis that is so common now. I think that's coming from a lot of focus on the Harman target curve, which is going to work for some people, not for others. For me, I definitely find myself being oversensitive to that upper mid-range area, and the Simgot EM2R has just a tiny little bit too much there. It's not so much that I don't enjoy them, I thoroughly enjoy them, but if I had to pick holes, it would be that I'd like to pull back just ever so slightly in the upper mid-range. Talking about imaging and focus, they do a really nice job of focusing the image well, and the general soundstage isn't particularly large, but it's well defined, and because the imaging is focused well, the separation of instruments is clear, and they're overall a very enjoyable listen. And so at this point in my listening process, I was thinking these were an excellent option for the price. But for just $9 more, there's two other options here on my desk, so let's talk about those, starting with the Shuoer D13. Once again, let's start with some thanks and some details, so thank you to Shuoer for sending these out for me to try. And in terms of the design of the Shuoer D13, it's a single dynamic driver design, and it's delivering some lovely sound. I had a bit of a play with those tuning nozzles I spoke about before, and to my ears, I prefer the brass coloured nozzles over the silver. It's not a huge shift overall, but I think the brass is just a little bit better in my opinion. Specifically what I was hearing with those brass nozzles was a smooth and slightly rich sound, but not something thick and overly muddy, just a rich and full sound. They're a very easy IEM to enjoy, but at the same time they're not lacking treble extension. It's more so that they're balancing treble and bass in such a way that there's richness, but still plenty of top-end extension. As I went back and forth between the two nozzles, the thing that I found about the two was that the silver nozzle actually pulls back the treble a little bit, and it ends up pulling it back too much and letting the bass get, for me, a little bit too much in the mix. So for me, the reason I like the brass nozzles better was they just better balance the treble with the natural kind of rich, bassy sound that the Shuoers are clearly starting with. And so by using the different nozzles, you can have a warmer, richer sound, or a better balanced sound with the brass, which is what I preferred. I felt like once again the imaging from the D13s was solid, but I wasn't yet sure if it was just as good as the EM2R because I hadn't compared them yet, so we'll come back around to that one shortly and see which one wins, but either way they were solid in the imaging department. And the soundstage once again was quite well defined, but again not particularly spacious, and I think probably a little bit more intimate than the EM2R. So it is going to be a closer sounding experience, but not at all congested, just not as open, not as spacious overall. And so as I said, we're going to come back around to a couple of comparisons at the end of what I feel like are the standouts, so we'll come back to the imaging between the EM2R and the D13, because to this point I think they're both really solid choices. But before we get to any comparisons, let's talk about the other IEM that's exactly the same price as the D13, and that's the Hifi P1 Max. The P1 Max is another planar magnetic earphone from Hifi. So they've now got the P1, the P2, I think the P1 Plus, I can't remember which one got the Plus, it was either the P2 or the P1. My point is, they keep churning out planar magnetic drivers with the P designation, and this is yet another in that mix. I want to start by saying a huge thanks to Melbourne ChiFi for sending over the P1 Max. And the other thing I want to mention here before I get to the sound quality is that I didn't particularly like the stock shape and feel of the tips from Hifi's P1 Max. And so I ended up borrowing the Aslers from the SeeAudio Bravery for this testing. And that for me is a slight knock on the P1 Max, is I don't think the tips there are as good as they could have been compared to some of the others. Having said that, everyone's ears are different, they might fit you just fine. Talking about the sound quality now, the first thing I noticed from the P1 Max was a very left-right sound. And I'm starting to think this could be a bit of a planar thing. I don't know for sure, but I feel like some of the planar magnetic earphones I've tried, and certainly not all of them, but some of the planar magnetics I've tried, and headphones too, can be very, very left-right in their split of the soundstage, and not at all any depth. So with the P1 Max, it's like everything happens inside your head, almost in a straight line between your ears, and I find it quite off-putting. The imaging in general is nicely focused and well-defined, but it's all happening behind the eyes, like I said, kind of in level with the ears, and it's just unnatural and off-putting to me. Overall, I'd say the tonality is fairly well balanced, but they do lack a bit of bass presence for me, and the treble is also slightly overdone in some ways, so the timbral quality isn't perfect. They're not overly treble focused or overly bass focused, but the subtleties and the nuance within each part of the frequency response aren't quite right for me. So just to make that clear, overall tonality I think is fine. They're not pushing all treble or bass, but the specific bass presence isn't quite as much as I'd like, and the specific qualities of the treble are just a little bit off for me. Now at this stage in my testing, I thought maybe they hadn't burned in properly. I left all the IEMs running off different systems overnight and right through the next day, but I have to say the P1 Max never quite changed. And so my conclusion at this point is I think Tin Hi-Fi maybe need to shelve making planers. I know that some of their planar magnetics have been okay, but none of them set the world on fire for me. None of them are coming close to things like the ThieAudio Elixir, which is not a planar, but it's in that ballpark of other planers on the market, like say the 7Hz Timeless. Even the Rapco Hook, I think, is a little bit better. And so for me, the P1 Max is probably the most disappointing sonically in this mix. Because of where it sits in terms of price, it's more expensive than the Topaz, and I think I'd choose the Topaz. And it just really doesn't compete with either the EM2R or the Shuoer D13. And so the P1 Max is not going to be a part of my comparisons coming up. I don't think it's worthy of that. Don't bother with it in my opinion. I'm sorry to have to say that. Andy at Melbourne ChiFi Audio has been a great supporter of the channel, sending over gear for me to try out, but on this occasion I can't recommend that you go and buy the P1 Max. It's just not a great IEM in my opinion. Of course, if you've got a different view, let me know in the comments down below, but for now let's move on and look at the SeeAudio Bravery, because this is where we start to take a huge jump from $119 up to $279. Now this one also came from Melbourne ChiFi Audio, so thanks again to Andy, and I should also mention that this one's a 4 balanced armature setup. So unlike the others which are using planars, hybrid, dynamic and balanced armature, or piezoelectric, this one's pure balanced armature, and you can definitely hear it. And what I mean by that is it's got a sound which is immediately kind of faster. It's got a sense of separation of individual frequencies for better and worse, which I'll get to in a moment. It's got a very different type of sound to any of the other 4 here, and I don't mean that in a good or a bad way. I'm just calling out the fact that it's clearly different because it's only the balanced armatures. The first thing I noticed about the Bravery was it's got that very clean, very crisp and articulate sound of balanced armatures, but it doesn't have the presence. It doesn't have the weight behind the bass and the depth in the sound that something like the D13 or the EM2R have, but what it does get in return is a wonderful sense of texture and clarity. It can at times get a little bit too crisp up top, depending on the source you're pairing it with, so do keep that in mind. But if you're hunting for an IEM that's got a bit more texture and clarity and less bass, then the Bravery could be in the mix. I felt like the Bravery also had a fairly flat soundstage presentation. It's nowhere near as flat as the P1 Max, and it's not as far back in the head, which is very helpful. But do keep in mind that it's not a particularly spacious and forward-throwing soundstage. It is quite linear, and it kind of sits just behind the forehead and in a left-right fashion. I have to say it's not my favourite presentation of soundstage. I do prefer an IEM that throws it a bit more forward, so it doesn't make it sound as much like it's all happening inside the head. But as I said, it's not as bad as the P1 Max, and it's not bad, it's just not my preference. As I continued to listen to the Bravery, the thing that really stood out to me as I went on and on through different tracks was layers and layers of detail. This is definitely a detail lover's dream IEM, at least at the price point, because those 4 balanced armatures are able to extract every different little sound across all the frequencies they cover. And I particularly like the fact that it's able to pull all that detail out without getting clinical or sterile or harsh. And so at this point in my listening, how I'd sum all of this up is that for me, there are kind of 3 clear standouts. We've got the Simgot EM2R as a standout here. We've also got the Shuoer D13, and then finally we've got the SeeAudio Bravery. And the reason I say each of these are standouts is because whilst they're not all my absolute favourite sound signature, they all do what they do well. So we've got detail and texture and clarity from the Bravery, admittedly with a bit less presence than I like. We've got a warm but detailed sound coming from the D13s that are maybe just a tiny bit too warm at times, and therefore maybe a little bit too intimate and closed in, but not claustrophobic. And then we've got this Simgot EM2R, which is a really lovely, warm and detailed sound at the same time, but it can't give you the detail resolution of something like the Bravery. And so the question for me now was, how do they stack up when I actually put them side by side and directly against one another? Is it worth spending more money on the Bravery, or are you going to have more fun with the D13 or the EM2R? Is the EM2R better than the D13? Let's jump in and find out. And of course, I also wanted to ask, are any of them better than the excellent Moondrop Aria Snow? And so my first test was to put the EM2R, the D13 and the Aria Snow in a 3-way battle. The track I used for this was Million Faces by Paolo Nutini, and starting with the Aria Snow as kind of my benchmark, the vocal on this track was quite close. It's a little bit inside the head once again. The bass was solid but not enhanced sounding, and what I mean by that is it was natural but solid. The snare and the cymbals are crisp but smooth, and I started to notice in this particular track, when he starts to push his vocals, some of those higher, louder notes from Paolo Nutini just started to get a bit harsh with the Snow. And it's not just the recording. I tried some other headphones to just check if it was the recording or if it was the IEMs, and it was definitely the snow. A character in the snow's sound allowed those upper mid-range notes, when there was a bit of volume behind them, to just get a little bit rough. Nothing major, but just enough that I noticed it. Switching over to the EM2R, and what I found was the vocal was brought a bit forward, so a bit closer to me, but the imaging was better and it was a more natural overall presentation. There was also a touch more presence and thump from the bass. You could feel it a bit more, but it wasn't overdone. So it was actually roughly on par with the Snow, maybe a little bit more bass, but the point was more that you could actually feel it. So there was a tactile, energetic drive to it, rather than it just being boosted, bloated bass. It was actually really well controlled. I feel like there was a bit less texture in the upper frequencies from the EM2R, so things were a bit more kind of smoothed off or refined depending on how you describe it. And whilst it did mean I was losing a little bit of sense of texture compared to the Snow, I found the EM2R to be the more enjoyable presentation. Before you think though that the EM2R is overly rich or smooth or rolled off or anything like that, I should specify that I was actually hearing more detail from the EM2R. It was just delivered differently. So there were more details available, I could hear more different sounds within the music. And so what I'd say is that they're more detailed, but they've got less of a sense of clarity. And I mean clarity kind of in the sense of any of you that have played with a photo editing app that has a clarity slider. It's more like the clarity slider in a photo app. So in the case of the Snow, it's a bit like the clarity is being enhanced by their tuning, and that can sometimes come back to bite you when it goes too far. Whereas it's like the EM2R has higher resolution and doesn't need as much of that clarity slider. So the details are there, they're all present and available, but they're not being pushed or forced or enhanced. And that to me makes the EM2R a very enjoyable and engaging listen that doesn't get fatiguing, that doesn't get overdone. And so at this point, the EM2R had pulled ahead of the Aria Snow, and I still love the Aria Snow, but it is worth, in my opinion, spending more on the EM2R. But that of course brought around the question of how the D13 would now stack up. And the answer is that it's actually got the sharpest focus of all three. I said before when I was talking about image focus that I didn't know if the EM2R or the Shuoer D13 had the better image focus, and the answer is it's the D13 for sure. It's got a beautiful sense of focus and clarity of exactly where the vocal or the lead instrumental, whatever it is, but that imaging is very, very clean. What it is also doing though is it's bringing the sounds a little bit closer to the listener, so if you prefer a bit more space in your listening, the EM2R will be better. If you don't care so much and it's about other qualities, then they're both very, very good. I feel like the overall tonality of the vocals in particular from the D13 is a little bit brighter, a little bit airier than it is from the EM2R. Both of them are excellent, both of them still probably lean towards being a fuller sound, but the D13 has a touch more air and is a little bit brighter overall, I'd say. As I went back and forth between the two, I felt like the D13 was probably the more refined, slightly smoother overall presentation, still very detailed, but it doesn't quite have the dynamics that the EM2R has. You don't feel the music in the same way that you do from the EM2R, and so it's going to give you two great options with different presentations. And so at the end of this comparison for me, it was very, very hard to separate the EM2R and the D13. They'd both clearly pulled ahead of the Snow for me. That was easy, but the two of them individually are very hard to separate. I like the look and the feel of the D13. I like the fact that it's got the changeable nozzles, but I can't deny that I also really enjoy that kind of tactile presentation that the EM2R has. And so I had to see which of these I'd take forward to consider if it was worth spending more on the Bravery. And the one that I ended up going to was the EM2R, because as I went back and forth, the EM2R, whilst technically I wouldn't say is better than the D13, but it's the one that I consistently found myself enjoying more. It's a very, very close call. It's going to be absolutely, I think, a 50-50 split, which one you would prefer more. But for me, the EM2R was my comparison point. And so now I moved on to my final comparison, which was to put the EM2R up against the SeeAudio Bravery, and at this point I thought I'd bring in the ThieAudio Elixir, which I recently reviewed and absolutely loved. And so I was comparing these across a whole bunch of tracks, one of which was Worry by the Robert Cray Band, starting with the EM2R, and it delivers this wonderful deep, deep bass on this track. The vocals again were nicely separated, and as the track got busier and busier, I did notice that the EM2R struggled to keep everything really well spaced, but it also didn't get too congested. It handled it pretty well, and the tonality was solid. Moving then over to the Bravery, and that sense of separation, particularly in the busy passages, was a clear and obvious upgrade. So very quickly we can say yes, there are reasons to spend more money on the Bravery, But it all depends on what you're actually looking for, so let's talk about a few more characteristics other than separation. And that is to say that there was a slight loss of the depth of the bass. It certainly wasn't bad from the Bravery. I think they're stronger than something like the Yuma, which for me was a bit bass light. That's another SeeAudio product. To me, the Bravery is better in that regard. It still has good bass. It just lacks that last little tiny bit of bass extension that something like the EM2R's dynamic driver can do better. Ultimately for me, everything from the SeeAudio Bravery was just a bit more separated, a bit clearer. There's more details available. There's a little bit more energy in the upper end that almost goes too far on things like cymbals, but doesn't quite. So I'd still say it's very, very good, but it's really skirting the line. So if you're very treble sensitive or you know you've got a bright source, the Bravery might not be the best choice for you, but it's definitely a lovely IEM. And for me, I can clearly see why you would spend more money than you would on the EM2R to get the Bravery. Not only are you getting a wonderful looking and feeling IEM with exceptional accessories, you're also getting a better technical performer. And so at this point, as I've already said, I brought the Elixir back into the mix because I absolutely love it. I think for $209 it's a brilliant choice of IEM. And so I plugged it in and continued listening to Worry by the Robert Cray Band to see how it compared to both the EM2R and the Bravery, because it kind of sits in the halfway point price-wise. And what I heard was that the Elixir is quite similar to the Bravery in many ways. It doesn't quite have the depth and extension of the EM2R, and that's definitely a standout from the EM2R. But what it does do is it brings out more subtle details, nuances, and textures from the mid-range. And it also provides a slightly more natural treble sound because it's not trying to push the detail from the treble. And so just to clarify what I mean there, I think it's more detailed than the EM2R overall. But it's not doing it by having a brighter tuning like the Bravery tends to, so much as a faster, fantastic driver. And so where I find the Bravery can push a little bit too far into slightly brighter treble, I think the Elixir's getting the tonality spot on. I would have loved to have the same level of bass extension that the EM2R delivers, but I think it strikes a really nice balance, that being the Elixir, between the general natural kind of tonality of the EM2R and the detail retrieval of the Bravery. And so what we're really left with here is three fantastic IEMs. I wouldn't say one of them is clearly better or worse than the others, and it's pretty cool because they're across three price points. So at any of these three price points, being roughly 100, roughly 200, and just under 300, you can get a wonderful sounding IEM. To recap what you're specifically getting, if you're getting the EM2R, you're getting a full-bodied, rich, deep bass sound with a tactile delivery, and still nice clarity and detail up top. With the Elixir, you're getting a wonderfully fast and detailed sound that's still got good bass presence, and also got a bit of a sense of tactility similar to the EM2R, but it's not got quite the richness to the sound while still maintaining very good tonality. When we then move to the Bravery, you are trading off a bit of weight in the sound, but what you're getting in return is a wonderful sense of separation and detail and clarity. It's coming at the cost of a slightly brighter tuning, which just skirts the line of being too much sometimes, but never quite crosses that line. And so we've got three fantastic options. That's not to say that the BQEYZ Topaz isn't worth a look in, because at $80 it's clearly significantly cheaper, and it's a really nice and unique sound. The piezoelectric driver does things that none of these other drivers do, and so depending on your preference, that could be good or bad, and it's one of those IEMs that if you get a chance to listen to, I think it's worth a go. Unfortunately, I am going to leave the P1 Max out here though, because I don't think it's got any particular redeeming features. There's nothing that makes me think I'll reach for that when I've got these other five on my desk. And so at this point, let me bring things to a close. I hope you found this review useful. I hope the comparisons and the descriptions have been helpful to help you make your decisions about your next ChiFi IEM purchase. And as always, if you have found it useful and helpful, I'd love it if you hit the like button, consider subscribing and ringing the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.